I see we are at the top of the hour. I am going to go ahead and get us started today's webinar. Good morning and welcome to our first 3Aware Real World Data, Real World Evidence webinar of 2025. I am the host, Amelia Hufford, Senior Vice President of Clinical and Regulatory Science at 3Aware. Briefly, 3Aware is a medical device-focused data provider and analysis platform that provides device-specific, down to the catalog number, structured and unstructured electronic health record data. This includes clinical notes, imaging, and patient-reported outcomes data. And again, this is medical device specific that we provide to the medtech community. In addition, 3Aware recognizes the wealth of information on medical products that exist and is collected during routine care. And we want to promote the discussion within the global medtech community on what can be gained from tapping into various real-world data sources. And also from the regulator perspective, what are those guidelines, expectations, requirements for the use of such data in generating clinical evidence? In addition to hosting webinars such as today's webinar, 3Aware will be holding a in-person symposium on April 29th of this year in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We'll be sharing information about this symposia and future events on our 3Aware LinkedIn and X social media platforms, as well as our website, 3aware.ai. Now, before I welcome our guest, Dr. Bethany Chung, I do have a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, please submit any questions you may have through the chat function of Zoom, which should be an icon that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Backstage, Ben, our helpful host and question aggregator, is going to be gathering these questions for us to address at the end of our discussion. We hope to allow at least 10 minutes for that. In addition, we'll be sending this recording to all registrants, so folks can visit the same registration link in the future to receive the recording link. You should, if you've already registered, have that sent to you via email. But if there are others that may be interested in today's content, please feel free to share with them this registration link so they can get the recording afterward. So without further ado, today we welcome Dr. Bethany Chung, who is the Senior Manager and a Principal Consultant at RQM Plus. Briefly, RQM Plus is a great partner of 3Aware and a leading medical device and IVD service provider that supports manufacturers throughout their entire product lifecycle via regulatory and quality consulting, via lab services and materials consulting, via clinical trial support and execution, reimbursement support, and also regulatory documentation automation via their Fern AI platform. So Bethany has discussed with us, that she's worked with clients who have many questions and needs regarding orphan devices in Europe, with which the recent MDCG 2024-10 guidance on the clinical evaluation of orphan medical devices has made a timely appearance, actually, to hopefully clarify some of those uncertainties. Today, though, we hope to provide additional clarity and shed some light on common myths and also how to go about sourcing and executing clinical evidence strategies for these products. So without further ado, I'm going to hopefully move my screen here to start us with a brief introduction on what is an orphan medical device and how are these defined. So Bethany, I'm gonna turn that over to you.
And thanks for that introduction, Amelia. I haven't been called doctor in a long time, so this is a little treat for me. But yeah, so we, especially when this guidance came out, we had a lot of excitement around manufacturers wanting to claim orphan status for their devices. What I want to do at the top here is just to level set. So how are orphan devices defined? And it's really broken down into two pieces. So the first piece has to do with prevalence. Your orphan device needs to be indicated for fewer than 12,000 EU patients per year. So we're really looking at small numbers of patients that can potentially be treated by your device. And then the second piece of it, we're really looking into the state of the art here. So the way that the guidance defines it is that there is either not currently a sufficient alternative treatment for this particular condition, or that your device shows some sort of benefit to patients compared to the existing alternatives. So what it's really getting at here is that you need to show your device is making a difference in these patients' lives. So it's a small set of patients, but your device can make a huge difference for this medical condition.
Thank you very much. Just out of curiosity, off the top of your head, what might be either an example medical device or potentially a patient population that might fit this definition?
Yeah, so one manufacturer that I've been working with recently actually has a drug delivery device that is specific to a particular medication that treats an orphan population, and the device they're making, in addition to that orphan population or orphan medical condition, they're looking specifically at the pediatric population. So we've kind of got an orphan indication within an orphan medical condition there. They need to show that they are specific to that particular medication, and then on top of that, kind of show that that medication is treating an orphan population. So we've got a novel device treating an orphan population by delivering medication.
Interesting. Yeah. I and previously I've had maybe another example of an orphan device and maybe orphan indication. So it was a device that was used in some very specific emergent procedures. It was an airway device. It was interesting because that device was in many ambulances, stocked, pretty well in all emergency departments, on emergency helicopters, medevacs, but rarely was it used. So it was interesting in that it was there. Sales were actually pretty high, but it was something that often expired on the shelf because of the limited amount of usage it actually had. So that was a unique challenge for us and trying to I guess, show how that product meets the definition of an orphan device. Kind of moving into that, I'm sure, and you've mentioned this, you've heard a lot of myths as you've talked to folks and as you've, worked through several of these projects. Can you tell me some of the common myths you hear about orphan devices?
Yeah, and this is a great question. And I think this speaks to just the excitement around this guidance coming out and manufacturers, seeing maybe another pathway in terms of clinical evaluation. So the first thing that we started to hear from manufacturers was, oh, well, and this also kind of speaks to your last example, was, well, we sell fewer than 12,000 of our devices in the EU per year, so we must be an orphan device. And kind of have to like slow down at that point. Like sales, like you said, can mean a number of things. Um, when we're looking at sales, I understand that this 12,000 number is a key piece of evidence that you need to show to prove that your device is an orphan device, but it's not necessarily sales. We're really just looking at who are the people, right? Who are the
Right.
patients that we're treating? So it speaks more to the prevalence of this particular condition, and the circumstances under which your device can be used rather than sales of the device itself. And the reason why we can't really focus on sales is because it doesn't necessarily give us the numbers that we need. We
Right.
can have overestimation, um, like in the example that you provided, and in the example that I provided, right? These are um, patients who are receiving, they have a single use device to
Right.
administer this medication, and they're administering it once a day. So that's going to be, a drastic overestimation of the number of patients being treated.
Right.
But then if you have something like reusable devices or capital equipment, that can drastically underestimate the number of patients who are being treated. So if you say, well, my MRI machine, we only sell 10,000 of them, it's like, yes, but you're treating hundreds of thousands of patients with it. So that doesn't
Right.
quite qualify. And then the other piece of it is, we really do have to get at that prevalence level. Sales doesn't necessarily give us prevalence because you may be one of many devices that can treat that condition. Um, there may be competitor devices, there may be alternative therapies out there, there may be a lot of patients with the condition who just don't want or need to be treated at all. So sales isn't great.
Right.
I wouldn't recommend it, but having been on my soapbox about it now for a couple of minutes, I have seen it work in one condition. We worked with a manufacturer who, and I think this is a special case, who works with their device treats patients who they can put forth a very good justification of why a large majority of the patients with this condition are being treated with either their device or an alternative device.
Right.
And then they've put together a report on their sales data as well as their market share. So they do have some information on the sales data from all of their competitors as well. Um, so, after all of my pontificating about how we cannot use sales data, we had a manufacturer successfully use it. So you've just got to be very cautious and put together, a comprehensive and a robust story around that sales data. So it's kind of just like one piece of the story in that case.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm thinking, similar to maybe the case you presented where it worked. What about a product that, maybe has been on the market for decades, right? And maybe sales are low, and maybe, they do have the majority market share, or sales, for similar products are very low. All under that 12,000 mark. But maybe it's not necessarily an orphan indication. Maybe it's just that there are newer and better products out there. What are your thoughts to that?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And that kind of speaks to this whole clinical evaluation process. So as part of the process, what we really want to do is get a comprehensive view of what the state of the art is, for this particular medical condition, for this particular indication. Because you're right, it can be that this was the standard of care, 15, 20 years ago,
Yes.
but it's evolved since then. So there are alternative treatments on the market or alternative diagnostic procedures on the market. Um, and that's reflected in the sales numbers where actual prevalence is not reflected in those sales numbers.
Yeah, there's a lot of consider, but I think, that I agree with that. Just because, it's not necessarily state of the art anymore doesn't necessarily mean it's an orphan device, and therefore, meets that requirement. So you mentioned prevalence data. how would one go about getting that data in order to justify, the low prevalence?
Yeah, what we really want to try to do is to have kind of a systematic and a robust way of getting that prevalence data. So the gold standard would likely be epidemiological data that is perhaps published by professional societies within that clinical area. So we're talking something like a clinical practice guideline, a consensus statement, something like that, that really reflects the state of the condition and the standard of care and the prevalence that can be treated by, specific treatments, devices, medications, alternatives. Um, but we're not going to find that in all cases, especially
Right.
with these orphan conditions, right? There's probably not a whole lot published on these conditions. So to get at that data, we maybe want to start looking into real world evidence from something like public health records. So these public health records can be, ideally, again, they would be at the EU level so that we could get really comprehensive look at it. If not, we can kind of go down to the national level and be able to extrapolate what that would mean for the entire EU. And if we can't get that, we can even go down to the level of a specific hospital system or hospital. And if we have prevalence data for, key hospital systems, then again, we can use that data and kind of understand how many patients are treated at that hospital, what the prevalence of that particular disease is, and be able to extrapolate it to the entire EU population.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And also something, I guess it sticks with me a little bit, but going back to that example of the airway device that essentially expires frequently on the shelf, I think real world evidence, real world data rather, on usage. So being able to maybe target several health systems and learn, via the medical records when the product was actually used. And then, maybe dividing that over sales for that health system, that can probably then be, extrapolated to the larger population. But yeah, it's there that I think, scenario of real world data supporting what is actual usage over sales would be um, a great tool and a great source of data to meet that justification.
Yeah, absolutely. And even being able to look in patient records and, looking at the medical claims data, right? So what
Yes.
codes are being associated with the patients who are admitted there? That's another way that we can kind of dig into that real world evidence and get some prevalence data out of it. Use it as much as we can, I think.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, that's a great myth. I wonder, have you heard other common myths from manufacturers that want to leverage orphan status?
Yeah. So the first one I talked about was more like we want to be an orphan device. And so the other thing that I hear is we want to be an orphan device because, and we have a lot of manufacturers assuming that this guidance kind of gives them an out from getting any clinical data. So they think, if we're an orphan device, we don't necessarily need clinical data to support our clinical evaluation report. Um, but we have to keep in mind that this guidance does give some allowances in terms of where that clinical data can come from. But you still need, under EU MDR, you still need to show that you're meeting GSPRs 1 and 8. So that means that you need your clinical performance, you need your clinical safety, and you need to use those to show that you have a favorable benefit risk ratio or benefit risk profile compared to the state of the art. So you're still going to need some kind of clinical evidence to be able to show that.
That's interesting. Is I guess then, you mentioned the question then is, do we need clinical data on the orphan device to get onto market? I think we're getting to the statement that that is best practice. Um, what about the quantity of clinical data that is necessary for a device? I think when you're thinking of enrollment rates, right, for a clinical trial, and these are very, very rare scenarios in which the device is used. How does one kind of come up with what is that threshold for quantity?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And this is, one of the favorite answers that we have in regulatory, which is it depends, right? So you have your class 3 and implantable devices where under MDR, we still need clinical investigations for those, unless they fit into one of the exemption categories in articles, I think it's 61.4 through 61.6. So for those devices, you can't necessarily get out of doing a clinical investigation. But, the question, like you said, comes down to how do we statistically justify our inclusion or our sample size for those? So what we see kind of spelled out in this guidance is that there are going to be limitations in clinical data and in gathering clinical data for these devices just because it's such a small sample size. Um, so if your device can only treat a couple of hundred patients throughout all of Europe each year, then this is a point where you come in and say, it's unreasonable for a notified body to expect me to do a robust randomized clinical trial with a statistically powered sample size in order to show clinical benefit. Um, and that's, it's just logistical in that case, right? Like if you focus on one or two sites or, even a handful of sites to conduct these at, you're still not going to be recruiting enough patients likely to match that statistically powered sample size.
Right.
Um, so it's going to be a balance, right? And it's going to be justifying or providing enough justification that your device is providing a clinical benefit when compared to risk, and showing that although you don't have a huge sample size, it's really a disservice to the patients and can be, a safety issue to the patients if you're keeping this device off of the market and not being able to treat patients with it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And perhaps, we'll talk about this later. Perhaps that justification for a certain lower threshold going into the market can then be, justified via post-market clinical follow-up methods and um, making sure to collect as much data as possible in the post-market phase to then bolster that evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of no matter how you get on the market here, if you're using your um, if you've got a smaller clinical investigation for those class 3 or implantable devices, if you're able to use equivalent devices,
Right.
if you're able to use extrapolation, and we can go into that a little bit more, but no matter
Yes.
which of these kind of evidence you go to market with, um, your notified body is going to expect you to do very robust PMCF to continue to follow these patients and understand the benefit risk profile of your device.
Yeah, I'm starting to think now about extrapolation, right?
Yeah.
And I know in Europe under MDR, you know, there is strict rules about equivalence. I think, if you were to compare US versus EU, there may be an ability to get to market in the US under, substantial equivalence, the 510(k) pathway. So, again, when you're talking about very low rates of treatment of indication, each usage, right? Each time this product is used, that's precious data and is informative. Um, what about the ability to extrapolate that data for EU purposes? What do you think is a, what are the opportunities there?
Yeah, and I really like that point you made that each bit of clinical data, each bit of clinical evidence that you can get is precious, because this is such a small population. And, if it's a small population in Europe that has the disease, it's highly likely it's also a small population in the US that has the disease. In fact, this 12,000 people prevalence was actually derived from some of FDA's policies as well. So we're looking at a very similar definition between the two. But when it comes to extrapolating data, there are kind of a couple of ways that we can take this. So one is, like you said, like if it is on the market for the same indication in another geography, absolutely take advantage of that data. You are going to have to provide some justifications. You're going to need to show that that data is transferable in terms of patient demographics, right? Are we looking at similar patient demographics, anatomically, physiologically? Another piece we're going to have to look at is the standard of care. So is the standard of care drastically different between the geography that you're in and the geography you're trying to leverage data from? And I do want to point out that that's not necessarily like a US EU or EU rest of world thing. It could also be within the EU. So is the standard of care in Germany the same as the standard of care in Italy? Well, if you're conducting, a small clinical trial in Germany, is that data going to be transferable to patients around the EU? So this kind of generalizability argument is going to have to come in kind of no matter where you're taking your data from. And then the other thing about extrapolation is that it doesn't necessarily need to be your device that you're getting
Right.
data from. So, and this I think is one of the big allowances within this guidance is there's an extrapolation table or flowchart or decision tree. And it talks about, are there similar devices? Taking this back to the idea of being on market in the US under 510(k), that means that that device does have a similar device or a predicate device that has the same indications and intended purpose. So
Right.
maybe that's a device that we can look to leverage and to extrapolate data from. Another example is maybe if you have an orphan population within a larger population that your device is intended for. So this kind of scrambles your brain a little bit. So I'm going to lay
Right.
it out a little bit more. I was working with a manufacturer who makes a breast biopsy marker, and they wanted to expand indications to cover not just adult patients, but also adolescent patients, so within the 12 to 17-year age range. And it's really hard to find adolescents who are getting breast biopsies, right?
Right.
Like they're not getting screening yet at this point in time. There's a very low prevalence in breast abnormalities in this population. So this is genuinely an orphan population. But, looking at a couple of different sources, they weren't able to find any evidence of use in adolescents at all. So this is one of those places where, now we're going to look at this pediatric high-risk population and compare it to to the adult population. Are there any differences we need to consider? Are there any added risks to this pediatric population that we can maybe, we can extrapolate data from the adult population while keeping these risks under consideration? And again, following up in the post-market phase to make sure that there aren't, trends happening when we start using this in more pediatric patients.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of those cases where even though it's not necessarily your device or a strictly equivalent device per EU MDR, you really can leverage that data and it can be useful to you and you can get this device out to the patients who need it a little more quickly.
Yeah. No, that's really informative. And I think too, when we're thinking about quality, right? When we're thinking about, anytime we're dealing with a very small population, what do we need to think about, Bethany, in terms of bias?
Yeah, there's bias all over the place.
Yeah.
So, of course, the gold standard whenever you want to, put something on the market is you treat a lot of patients and you have a nice, strong, robust data set that accounts for a lot of variability. Um, of course, we don't even have a large pool of patients to choose from in the case of orphan devices. So we're looking at a very narrow set of patients. Um, and so we have to consider bias and we have to consider how well we can generalize this information. If we are designing a clinical trial, like we said, it's going to be a small clinical trial at a handful of sites, we're not really getting a lot of variability. And that is kind of the point in these large scale clinical trials is that you can uh, just focus on one variable and control all of your other settings. But in the real world, that's not what we're seeing when we're treating these patients. So we really want to understand how these devices are being used, how they're performed, if we're going to have, 20 different physicians using them on patients. So in that case, I think it's actually a lot better to go the real world evidence route to look at these patients. And, it does account for some of that variability and it highlights some of that variability, but that makes the data a lot more generalizable to a larger population, to the entire patient population. And at the same time, that kind of speaks to the quality of the data. Um, and at the same time, that's going to help with the quantity of data. So if we're not focusing on one or two sites, and we can kind of expand to everyone who's using this in the real world, we're going to cast a wider net, basically. And we're going to capture a lot more of these patients and be able to report on them. And that will just strengthen the clinical data that we do have.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes absolute sense. In addition, I'm thinking about types of evidence. And I do know that the 2024-10 guidance talked about, a possible role for non-clinical data. Have you seen that, or have been able to leverage non-clinical data in any of, the orphan products you've been working with?
Yeah, and this is, I like that it's focused on here, but this should be something that you're really doing for all of your medical devices. You want to make sure you have that really strong bench data to make sure, you're meeting all of your user needs. You have that usability, human factors testing. You've got your verification and validation data to make sure you're hitting those essential performance, essential safety requirements that might be in related standards. Um, and if you have any animal testing, this is a really great field to highlight that animal testing, to conduct the animal testing, because there is such a small pool of clinical evidence that you'll be able to get from it. So yeah, we really want to focus on basically that usability, that verification and validation testing, and leverage really any animal testing that you can use to justify clinical requirements. So those, in addition to your real world evidence, either on your device or similar devices that you can extrapolate from. One other area that, I just kind of want to put the seed in people's minds right now, because I think it's still up and coming, but I want people to start thinking about it in the regulatory world here, is in silico clinical trials. And
Mm.
especially for something like an orphan patient population, where we're going to have those small numbers, we're going to want to understand how to generalize that data that we have. There is computer modeling and simulation that is kind of looking into this area right now. The field of, creating digital twins and tweaking them to make digital families, that can really help expand your patient pool and have, your actual patient pool and your virtual patient pool at the same time. So we're not quite there yet, but
Right.
I want people to start thinking about it at the same time.
No, that's great. And we have heard about that. And I think, that's something we're going to be interested in future discussions. But yeah, thank you for bringing in silico clinical trials up. I want to talk a little bit about how to source clinical data for these orphan products and like what other types, of sources are acceptable.
Yeah, and we touched on this a little bit, but I want to
Yeah.
dive a little deeper into this. So like I said, it's very important to keep following these patients, to keep following use of your device in the post-market phase. Um, and even within the guidance, it's very specific about expectations and the quantity of data that you're getting. So the guidance does suggest that you follow up on patients, and they say, if you are contracting sites, the expectation is that you're recruiting at least 90% of patients using your devices at those sites. So, when I hear 90%, that is a huge amount of patients.
Right.
Um, and we want to, when we do follow these patients, we want to make sure that we're addressing any gaps in the pre-market data. So, when you go through your clinical evaluation, when you first are putting this device on the market and you take into account all of the evidence you have, you've got your preclinical evidence, you have your clinical evidence, you have your real world evidence, and you're putting it all together, and maybe you find a couple of gaps. Not
Right.
enough gaps to keep you off the market yet, but enough that we're going to want to see follow up in the long term. And that, it may be as small as we haven't seen this being used in the elderly population yet. So we want to make sure that we're capturing any use in the elderly population. If you, see one safety concern that maybe you weren't expecting in your pre-market evidence, you want to make sure you're following up on that in the post-market phase. And you also want to account for the lifetime of the device. So if this is, say, a long-term implant, like the breast biopsy marker that I was talking about, that could
Right.
potentially be a permanent implant. So we want to make sure that we're capturing long-term longitudinal data on these patients. And that's really post-market phase is the only time that you're able to do that. Um,
Yeah, no, and I think here is where, the patients that you have, that long-term follow-up, right? Registries would be an important source of tracking those patients. Retrospective studies, because of the, slow enrollment rates, bolstering some data by going back in time. And, maybe instead of collecting data from a handful of sites, you may now be able to collect data from tens to hundreds of sites, because you can do that retrospectively and get some of that information. I think, would it be fair to say the wider net you cast for this data collection, maybe the more likelihood of success you'll have in gathering enough clinical evidence.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And also the more diverse a population you're going to get in that respect as well. Um,
Exactly.
One thing that we do want to keep in mind when we're looking at things like registries and real world evidence, though, is your ability to get the data that you're looking for. And this,
Yeah.
it may be uh, that you're speaking to the physicians who are using your device and making sure they record within the medical record or within the registry those specific performance outcomes that you want to be tracking, or specific safety trends that you want to be tracking as well. But if, we're measuring a certain level of a particular hormone in the body as a reaction, for example, you just want to make sure that that is being captured somewhere if you're going to focus on trying to get that in a real world setting or in a retrospective setting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we're getting to the end of our time, and we want to leave a couple minutes for a couple questions we've got. But before we sign off on our discussion, as you mentioned, um, following these products over their total expected lifetime. But even beyond that, what about when I think we mentioned before, you may have products that, um, you know, are no longer used because maybe there's a new, better approach. The state of art has changed. How do you kind of, where do you put that view of the data as well? Not just on your product in that population, but how should you be looking at the disease state as a whole?
Yeah, and that is, I feel like that's just as important as looking at your product in particular. If you want to, question why this needs to be done, the boring answer is look at the MDR. You need to be following the
Yeah,
state of the art.
right,
Like your benefit risk profile needs to be favorable, considering the generally accepted state of the art. But when you're thinking about it in reality, like you also don't want to be the dinosaur, right? Like you
right.
want to understand where your place is, how your product is performing, and if there's something a little bit better than your product out there, maybe you want to be evolving. So it's very important to monitor that state of the art in the pre-market phase, like we talked about earlier, and continuously throughout the post-market phase.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I wanted to again thank you, Bethany, for your time today and your expertise and sharing this information with folks who've joined. Thank you all who've joined the webinar, either in real time or folks who are looking at the recording later. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact myself. My email address is here on the screen, as well as Bethany. Her contact information is here as well. We do have time for one question, and this one actually I think is a good one. We know that now we know what an orphan device is, what the considerations are, and what the expectations are. But what does the regulatory body or framework, and I think this is mentioned in the guidance, what are the incentives to a manufacturer for investing in products like these? Do they have any type of specialized review? What is there to help support the research and development in orphan products?
That's a great question. And I may have to go back and reread the guidance to
Oh
give
yeah.
you a really great answer on it. But I think the immediate benefit that it gives you is it does provide, allowances in terms of quantity of clinical evidence
Yeah.
and where you're getting that clinical evidence from. Like it gives you some leniency in whether it's specifically on your device, on a strictly equivalent device, or on a similar device or a similar patient population.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know in the US there are, some specialized focused review.
Yeah.
I too, I think, need to review what that paradigm is in Europe. But I want to echo the question in that I do think there needs to be some incentive, especially with the additional burden for clinical evidence through EU MDR. We need to make sure we still have the ability to be, um, you know, um, focused on research and development of these products, that there likely isn't as much of a financial incentive to bringing them to market.
Yeah, yeah. And it comes down to the patients, right? They need
Absolutely.
an advocate. And when you are such a small set of patients, you don't have a very loud advocate all the time. And that's what these manufacturers can provide.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bethany. Thanks everyone for joining our webinar. Again, please follow us if you haven't already on our LinkedIn page, our Three Aware LinkedIn page, as well as on X. And you should probably receive information about how to access the recording of this webinar with this week. If not next week, early next week, please share the registration page for anyone who you think might be interested in this discussion. And with that, I will go ahead and say goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.